the goodwill of my heart and my supplication toward God for them are indeed for their salvation. And that we understand that. Don't we want that for our brothers and family members and sisters and fleshly and those we care about in the world and perhaps those who've left? Don't we want basically that they be okay? That's what we want for everybody. That's a basic human desire, and it's really brought up in Christianity as a light. But then he says in verse 2, "For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God." He said they're sincere. But then he said, "But not according to accurate knowledge. For because of not knowing the righteousness of God," and they just did not know it, they didn't get it, and here's their fault, "but seeking to establish their own." Any one of us can do that. We can be in an argument with somebody, and we may have the right argument, but we may just get a little defensive. And when we're defensive, we don't hear anything. So for seeking to establish their own, he says they did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God. And then he gets to his point. He says, "For Christ is the end of the law." And that's significant, because people were holding on to details that they found in Scripture that some of the leaders were still saying this is very, very important. And up until then, that had been God's organization to those Jews who were there. And the argument was, well, what about this detail? What about that detail? And after saying that, Paul said, let's get back to the basics. So we're going to do both of those things today. Don't have a lot of time to talk about it. This used to be a 45-minute outline. It has been shaved down a little bit. But just because many of us probably have experience, can I just get a show of hands? Do we have any pioneers in the audience, or anyone who has ever been a pioneer? Oh, look at that. It's beautiful. Don't forget. And a lot of you then are really going to understand where we're going with this, because, you know, if you ever have the privilege of pioneer, you get face to face with every Thomas in the neighborhood. And they're not polite like a Jehovah's Witness Thomas. You know, I could be a Thomas, but I'm going to be polite. They might say very directly, more like the real Thomas, "Hey man, that doesn't make sense." So if we understand what it's like to reach people in the territory, we can bring it right back home. And our outline just has really three things to talk about. And the first one is, what is the rulership that we have to submit to? You know, that's become a confusing issue. And we've had, we know people in our territory believe it's one thing. Maybe God's rulership is an emotional state. Maybe it's a mode of behavior. We've shocked people by saying that it may be a government. That's been a little surprising for people to hear. And we might have gone over details about when that government took power in 1914 and chronology and generations. And boy, even pioneers. Do we really want to get wrapped up in that when somebody is asking, why should I submit to God's rulership now? Is that where we want to go? I don't. I can do it. Maybe we can all do it. But that's not really a good place to go. We're going to go directly to Psalm 2. And if you know the Psalm, you know exactly what the point is of this. We have a song about this song, right? Kiss the sun in the sky. You know the song. It's a good song. Okay. And I don't want that. Okay. So in Psalm 2, verse 2, it says, "The kings of the earth take their stand. High officials gather together as one against Jehovah and against his anointed one, saying, let's throw off their shackles." And, we don't want to live under that rulership. Okay? We may see that today from nations. We don't even need to get specific on that, do we? And they're basically saying, we do not want God's kingdom. So the first thing is to accept the kingdom. And that means accepting what they're rejecting there, which is the king. So we probably know who the king is. We probably don't have a single person in here who would fail that question on a test. We know Jesus Christ is the king. But let's just take it a little bit further and go to Galatians chapter 1 and verse 8. Because we can get caught up in details just as easily as it can happen in Christendom. We've got a big Bible here. There's a lot of things that we can get into. And Paul gives us a warning here. I know, it's slower. I realize that paper is slower. I know. It gives you time to think. Galatians 1:8, Paul gives this warning. And he says, there's a lot of talk, a lot of excitement going on. But in verse 8 he says, however, even if we or an angel out of heaven were to declare to you as good news something beyond the good news that we declared to you, let him be accursed. Well, let's give that a tiny bit of thought. We can hear something from someone we respect in the organization. We can hear something from the person who taught us the Bible. We can hear something from an elder. I could say something right now that might not be the right thing. And that doesn't stop at the level of elder. That can go all the way up. And if we know anything about the theocratic history of this organization, we know that that can happen all the way up. So how do we keep this point of how to submit to God's rulership now with all of the things that could be said, all of the speculations, all of the hard lines, all of the things that could be said? Well, Paul said, stick to the basics. What was the good news that he had declared to them in the past? It was very simple. There is a king, it's Jesus Christ, and the law is over. And you can approach God freely. And there was a lot written about it. Now, we have new things. Of course, we're in a different era. There are new details. But the fundamental idea is to respect the king. So we have to just make sure we're doing it. And one more scripture on that will be Romans 10:10. We know this verse really, really well, I think. We especially know verse 13, but in 10, or verse 9, excuse me, he says, if you publicly declare with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and exercise faith in your heart that God raised him up from the dead. Notice these are very basic things. But if we talked about that and we don't hide that, then we can make a public declaration for salvation. And in verse 13, we can be saved. So, by keeping it simple, and by sticking to the scriptures as often as we possibly can, we'll be in a pretty good position to make sure that we're letting God's rulership be over us. Now, the more interesting concept of this is to figure out what we should do. Very sorry. There's an emergency.
Would you like candy?
Oh, thank you very much.
That was good.
I was back in the Turkish. So, thank you very much for coming out. Just get my notes. Apologize for that. Yes, for the Albert. And each week we have a discourse here on Sunday, and next week